The lawyer cleared his throat, looked at me over his glasses, and read the sentence that my family had waited 3 years for me to hear. To my daughter Claire, he read, I leave nothing. She knows why. Across the polished conference table, my mother folded her hands and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. My brother Aaron did not even look up from his phone. My sister Bethany reached over and squeezed our mother's hand, as if the two of them had just won something. And, in a sense, they had. They had spent 3 years engineering this exact moment, the moment the overlooked daughter, the disappointment, the one who had abandoned the family, was finally, officially, legally erased from it. What none of them knew what my father had known, and what he had arranged with a care that still makes me cry when I think about it, was that the will being read in that room was not the document that mattered. It was a decoy. My father had left a second set of instructions with a different attorney, in a different office, across town, and those instructions did not say, I leave Claire nothing. They said the opposite. They said everything. But before I tell you what my father actually did, the quiet, brilliant, devastating thing he arranged before he died, to protect the one child who had loved him honestly from the 3 who had only loved his money, you need to understand how a family decides, years in advance, to write one of their own out of existence. And you need to understand why they were so certain I would simply accept it. If this story pulls at something in you, take a moment to like and subscribe only if it resonates. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know who's with me tonight. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 43 years old. And for most of my life, I was the family's designated disappointment. I want to be precise about that word, because in my family, disappointment was not an insult thrown in anger. It was a role, assigned early, maintained carefully, and referred to almost with affection, the way you might refer to someone's height or the color of their hair. Aaron was the successful one. Bethany was the beautiful one. And Claire was the disappointment. It was simply understood. The strange part, the part that took me decades to understand, is that I had not actually done anything to earn the title. I was not a troubled child. I did not fail out of school or get into trouble with the law or break my mother's heart in any of the dramatic ways that might explain such a label. My crime was quieter and, in my family's eyes, far worse. My crime was that I wanted a different life than the one they had planned for me, and I had the audacity to go and build it. I can tell you the exact moment the role was assigned because I've replayed it 1,000 times. I was 14. We were at dinner, the whole family, at the big table my grandfather had built. And my mother was going around the table doing the thing she did, the thing I didn't have a name for until I was an adult. She was narrating each of us, out loud, deciding who we were. Aaron's going to take over the business someday, aren't you, Aaron? Bethany, with that face, she could be on television. And then she got to me, and she paused, and she looked at me with a kind of puzzled dissatisfaction, and she said, and Claire, well, we'll see about Claire. We'll see about Claire. 4 words, and in them, my entire childhood was decided. Aaron had a future. Bethany had a gift. And I had a question mark, we'll see, which everyone at that table understood to mean, we're not impressed yet, and we don't expect to be. I had done nothing to earn it. I was a straight-A student. I was quiet, kind, no trouble to anyone. But I had committed the one sin my mother could never forgive. I was hard to categorize. I didn't fit the story she wanted to tell. Aaron was the heir. Bethany was the beauty. And every family drama needs a disappointment. And the role was open. And I was the one who happened to be sitting there when my mother went looking to cast it. Here is the thing about being assigned that role at 14. You spend the next several years trying to escape it by being good, by achieving, by pleasing, by earning. And it doesn't work, because the role was never about your behavior. It was about my mother's need for a family in which everyone had a fixed place. The disappointment is a necessary character. If I had somehow become undeniably successful in a way she approved of, she would have had to find a new disappointment, and the whole structure would have wobbled. So no matter what I did, I stayed the disappointment, because the family needed one, and I had been cast. It took me until my 20s to understand that the only way to escape a role like that is not to play it better. It's to leave the stage entirely. So I did. And leaving the stage, in my mother's eyes, was the ultimate confirmation that I had been the disappointment all along. I can point to the exact phone call where I abandoned the family, because in my mother's retelling, the version she told for 20 years, it was a single, dramatic act of betrayal. In reality, it was a Tuesday, and it was the most ordinary conversation imaginable. I was 19, in my first year of college, 3 states away, and I called home to tell my parents that I'd decided on my major and that I wanted to stay in the city after graduation to pursue it, rather than come home to work at Bennett Restaurant Supply. That was it. That was the whole crime. A 19-year-old telling her parents she'd found her path, and it led away from the family business. My father, on the extension, said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." My mother was silent for a long moment. And then she said, in a voice I can still hear, "So, you're abandoning us. After everything we've done for you, you're just going to walk away from this family." And she hung up. That was the founding of the legend. Over the next 20 years, that ordinary phone call, a young woman choosing her own life, was retold and reshaped until it became the story of the ungrateful daughter who turned her back on her family. I heard the legend evolve over the years at the rare gatherings I attended. It grew details it never had. In some versions, I had said cruel things. In some versions, I had rejected my father specifically. None of it was true. But the truth didn't matter, because the legend served a purpose. It justified everything that came after. If I was the daughter who abandoned the family, then every subsequent act of exclusion was not cruelty, but consequence. They weren't shutting me out. They were simply giving me what I'd chosen. That is how families like mine work. They don't punish you for who you are. They invent a version of you that deserves the punishment, and then they punish that version, and they call it fairness. Let me tell you about Aaron and Bethany, because to understand this story, you have to understand that they were not monsters. They were something more ordinary, and, in a way, sadder than that. Aaron was the golden son, and like most golden children, he was profoundly frightened underneath it. His whole identity was built on being the heir, the successor, the one who would run the business. He had never developed a self outside of that role, because he had never needed to. And that meant that any threat to his position, including, God forbid, a sister who might have some claim to the family legacy, felt to him like a threat to his very existence. He wasn't cruel to me because he hated me. He was cruel to me because some animal part of him understood that in a family with a fixed number of valued positions, my existence was a threat to his. Every family gathering was, to Aaron, a competition for a scarce resource, our parents' approval, and he had decided long ago that the way to win was to make sure I lost. Bethany was different. Bethany was the beauty, and she had learned, the way beautiful, favored children often do, that her job was simply to be adored, and to reflect our mother's values back at her flawlessly. Bethany had no real opinions of her own about me. She simply took her cues from our mother, and our mother had decided I was the disappointment. So Bethany treated me as one, not out of any personal animosity, but out of a lifetime of using our mother's approval as her compass. If our mother had decided tomorrow that I was wonderful, Bethany would have adjusted within the hour, and would genuinely not have remembered ever thinking otherwise. I tell you this not to excuse them, but because it matters for what my father did. He understood his children with a clarity none of us knew he possessed. He saw that Aaron's cruelty came from fear, and Bethany's came from emptiness, and my mother's came from a need for control. And he saw that I, the disappointment, the question mark, was the only one of his children who had been forced, by my exclusion, to build an actual self. The others never had to. They had their roles, I had only myself, and that, it turned out, was what my father valued most. My family owned a business, Bennett Restaurant Supply, a mid-sized company that my grandfather had started, and my father had grown into something genuinely successful. And in my family, there was one path to being loved. You joined the business, you stayed close to home, you orbited my mother, and you played your assigned role in the family drama forever. Aaron did that. He went to work for my father at 22 and never left. Bethany did that, in her way, marrying a man my mother approved of, and living 20 minutes from my parents' house, and being, always, present. I did not do that. At 19, I left for college 3 states away, and then I stayed there. I built a career in a field my family didn't understand and never asked about. I made a life full of people they never met. And by leaving, by wanting something other than the family business and the family orbit, I committed the one unforgivable sin. I chose myself over them. And a family like mine never forgives that. They just find quieter and quieter ways to punish it for the rest of your life. But there was one person in my family who understood. My father. My father, William Bennett, was a quiet man. He was not warm in the demonstrative way. He did not say, "I love you" easily, did not hug, did not make grand gestures. He was a man of few words who had spent his life being spoken over by my mother, who filled every room she entered, and left very little air for anyone else. For most of my childhood, I thought my father was simply absent, physically present but emotionally somewhere else, a quiet man in the corner of a loud family. I was wrong about that, and I did not learn how wrong until much later. My father saw everything. He saw the way my mother sorted her children into roles and enforced them. He saw the way I was quietly diminished at every family gathering, the way my achievements were met with a change of subject, the way my leaving was treated as a betrayal rather than the healthy act of independence it actually was. He saw all of it. He just didn't have the tools or, I think, the courage to fight my mother directly. She was a force, and he had spent 40 years learning that the path of least resistance was silence. But every so often, my father would find a way to let me know that he saw me. When I was home for a rare visit, he would appear in the kitchen late at night, when everyone else was asleep. And we would really talk in a way we never could when my mother was awake to redirect the conversation. He would ask me about my work, my real work, and he would listen to the answers. He would ask if I was happy. He would tell me, in his quiet way, that he was proud of me for building a life on my own terms, even though he could never say it when the others could hear. I want to give you one of those midnight conversations in full, because it's the one I think about most, and because it's the one where, though I didn't know it, my father first hinted at what he was planning. I was 38. I'd flown home for Christmas, dreading it as I always did, and after 2 days of my mother's cold civility and my siblings' practiced dismissiveness, I'd retreated to the kitchen at midnight to make tea and breathe, and my father appeared, the way he always did, in his old robe, moving quietly so as not to wake the house. He made himself a cup of tea and sat across from me, and for a while we didn't say anything. That was one of the things I loved about my father. He was the only person in my family with whom silence was comfortable, not a vacuum to be filled. Then he said, "You know why I like you best, Claire?" I nearly dropped my cup. My father did not say things like that. "Dad, I do," he said simply. "I like you best. I probably shouldn't say it. A father's not supposed to have a favorite. But I'm 70 years old and I've earned the right to a few honest sentences." He turned his teacup slowly on the counter. "You want to know why? It's not because you're the most successful, though you are, whatever your mother says. It's not because you're the kindest, though you might be that too. It's because you're the only one who ever comes into this kitchen at midnight to talk to me. The others come to this house for their mother, for what they can get. You're the only one who ever sat with me just to sit with me." He looked up, and his eyes were wet. "Do you know how lonely it is, Claire, to be surrounded by a family your whole life and know that only one of them actually sees you, and that she's the one they've all decided doesn't count?" I started to cry. He reached over and patted my hand, awkwardly, a man not practiced in physical affection. "Don't cry," he said. "I'm not telling you this to make you sad. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I see you too. They think you're the disappointment. I think you're the only one of my children who turned out to be a whole person. And someday," he said, and here his voice changed, took on a weight I didn't understand at the time. "Someday I'm going to make sure you know that I meant it, not just in words. Words are cheap in this family. Your mother has 1,000 words. I'm going to make sure you know in a way that can't be argued with." I thought he was just being sweet, an old man, sentimental at midnight. I had no idea he was telling me, as directly as he dared, exactly what he had already begun to do. Those midnight kitchen conversations were the truest relationship I had with anyone in my family. And I did not fully understand, until after he was gone, that my father had been paying attention all along, and that he had been quietly, carefully planning to do right by me in the one way he knew my mother could never override. There's something I've never told anyone, and I'm going to tell you, because I think some of you will understand it in a way my family never could. For most of my adult life, even after I'd built a good life far away, I kept a specific fantasy. In the fantasy, something would happen. I was never sure what that would finally make my family see me. Some achievement so undeniable, some moment so clear, that my mother would look at me and say the words I had waited my whole life to hear. "I was wrong about you. You were never the disappointment. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry." I'm 43 years old, and I need to tell you the hardest thing I've learned. That moment was never going to come. Not because I didn't achieve enough, I achieved plenty. But because my mother's view of me was never actually about me, it was about her need for a family with a fixed cast of characters. No achievement of mine could ever have changed it, because it was never based on my achievements in the first place. I could have cured a disease and my mother would have found a way to make it evidence of my selfishness for not curing it closer to home. The fantasy of finally being seen by the people who refuse to see you is the cruelest prison the overlooked child lives in, because it keeps you auditioning. It keeps you coming back, keeps you trying, keeps you hoping that this time, this achievement, this gesture, will be the one that flips the switch. And it never flips, because there is no switch. There is only a person who decided who you were before you could speak, and who will go to their grave holding that decision, because it was never really about you at all. My father's letter, in the end, was the thing that freed me from the fantasy, because it turned out someone had seen me all along, just not the person I'd been auditioning for. I'd been performing my whole life for my mother, hoping she'd finally applaud. And the whole time, in the back of the room, quietly, my father had been watching, and he had seen every act, and he had never needed a performance to know exactly who I was. Here is how a family writes you out of existence. It does not happen all at once. It happens by degrees, over years, so slowly that by the time you notice, it is nearly complete. There was a Thanksgiving, about 6 years before my father died, that I think of as the moment I stopped hoping and started seeing clearly. I had flown home. I always flew home, some part of me still auditioning. And at dinner, my mother went around the table asking everyone to share what they were grateful for, a wholesome tradition. On its face, she started with Aaron, who talked about the business, and my mother beamed. Then Bethany, who talked about her children, and my mother beamed. Then the grandchildren, the spouses, each one receiving my mother's warm, engaged attention. And then she reached me. And she did not stop. She looked right past me, to the person on my other side, and asked them what they were grateful for. She skipped me. At a table, out loud, in front of the whole family, on a holiday whose entire purpose is gratitude, my mother went around the circle and simply omitted me, as though my chair were empty. Nobody said anything. That's the part that still lands hardest. Aaron didn't say, "Mom, you skipped Claire." Bethany didn't say it. My father, and this is the thing I understand now that I didn't. Then my father opened his mouth, and then closed it, and looked down at his plate, and I saw something in his face that I read, at the time, as weakness. I know now it wasn't weakness. It was a man who had learned that fighting my mother out loud only made things worse for me, and who was, at that very moment, probably thinking about the trust, about the documents, about the quiet war he was already winning on my behalf. But in the moment, all I saw was my father looking away, while my mother erased me at the dinner table. I drove back to my hotel that night. I never stayed at the house, even then, and I sat in the parking lot, and I understood, finally, that there was nothing I could do to be included in that family. The exclusion wasn't a problem to be solved. It was the point. And the only sane response was to stop trying. It took me another 6 years to fully let go. But that Thanksgiving, in that parking lot, is where I first understood that the family I was longing for did not exist, and never had. It started, in earnest, about 5 years before my father died. That was when my mother began, subtly, to rewrite the family history. At gatherings I wasn't present for, I heard about this later, from my father. In those midnight conversations, my mother began referring to me as the daughter who had abandoned the family. Not moved away, not built her own life, abandoned. The word did specific work. It transformed my independence into a wound I had inflicted on them, and it cast my mother as the victim of an ungrateful child. Then came the business. As my father aged and began, slowly, to hand over control, the question of succession arose. And my mother made sure, in 100 small ways, that the succession conversation excluded me entirely. Aaron would run the business. Bethany's husband would have a role. And I had made my choice, hadn't I? I had abandoned them. Why would I have any claim to the thing my grandfather built? I want to be honest about something. I did not particularly want to run a restaurant supply company. That was never my dream, and I would not have taken it if offered. But that is not the point. The point is that I was never offered. I was never even included in the conversation. My family made a series of enormous decisions about our shared inheritance, about my grandfather's legacy, about my father's life, work, and they made those decisions as though I did not exist, as though I had already died, or had never been born. And the cruelest part is that they did all of this while my father was still alive, still watching, still quietly seeing everything. They just assumed his silence was agreement. They assumed that because he never fought them, he was on their side. They could not have been more wrong. There was a specific incident, about 2 years before my father died, that I need to tell you about, because it's the one that finally made me understand exactly how far my family was willing to go. My grandmother, my father's mother, had a ring. Nothing extravagant, but beautiful, an antique with a small sapphire, the kind of heirloom that carries a family's history in it. And before she died, when I was in my 20s, she told me, privately, that she wanted me to have it. "You're the one who's like me," she said. "You see things. The others just look." She told my father too. It was understood, quietly, that the ring would come to me. 2 years before my father died, at a family Christmas, I saw the ring on my sister Bethany's hand. I didn't say anything at first. I thought maybe I was mistaken, but it was unmistakable, my grandmother's sapphire, on Bethany's finger, worn casually, as though it had always been hers. And when I finally asked my mother about it, as gently as I could, she looked at me with genuine puzzlement and said, "Oh, that old thing? I gave it to Bethany years ago. It suits her. You were never really the jewelry type, Claire." I gave it to Bethany years ago, as though it had been hers to give. As though my grandmother's explicit wish and my father's knowledge of it simply evaporated because my mother had decided the ring suited the beautiful daughter better than the disappointment. It was such a small thing, a ring, and yet it contained the entire architecture of my erasure. They didn't just overlook me. They actively redistributed the things that were meant to be mine to the children they preferred, and they did it so casually, so guiltlessly, that when I objected, I was made to feel petty for mentioning it. I found out later from the letter that my father had seen the ring on Bethany's hand too, and that it had been, in his words, the moment I stopped hoping your mother would ever do right by you, and started making sure I would. The theft of a small sapphire ring was, unbeknownst to any of them, the thing that set my quiet father to work on the arrangement that would eventually undo them all. I want to tell you about the group chat because it's a small modern detail that captures how the erasure worked day to day. My family had a group chat, my mother, Aaron, Bethany, their spouses. I was not in it. This was not an oversight. When smartphones became the way families stayed in touch, a chat was created, and I was simply never added. I learned of its existence by accident, when Bethany referenced something from the chat at a rare gathering and then went quiet, realizing her mistake. For years, my family coordinated their entire lives in a conversation I wasn't part of. Holidays were planned there. News was shared there. Photos of my niece and nephew children I barely got to know were posted there daily. A whole running stream of family life flowing past in a channel I couldn't see. When my father got his diagnosis, in the final year, I found out days after everyone else, because the news went to the chat first, and I wasn't in the chat. I want you to understand what that does to a person. It is one thing to be treated coldly at gatherings. It is another to know that there is a live, running conversation containing your entire family's daily life, and that everyone in your family sees it every day, and that not one of them, in years, ever thought or ever chose to add you. Every day, a small decision was made, by omission, to keep me outside. Not dramatically, just quietly, continuously, the way you might leave a light off in a room no one uses. My father, I learned later, was barely in the chat either. He found it exhausting, my mother's constant narration of the family's life. He and I were the two members of the family who lived mostly outside the chat, him by temperament, me by exclusion. Two people standing outside the same window, it turned out, looking in at a family that had decided neither of us quite counted. My father was sick for about a year before he died, and that year taught me the final, hardest lesson about my family. When the diagnosis came, a cancer, aggressive, with a timeline measured in months, my family mobilized. But they mobilized around my mother, around the drama of her impending widowhood, around the logistics of the estate. What they did not do, what it seemed to genuinely never occur to them to do, was make space for me to say goodbye to my own father. I had to fight for every visit. When I said I wanted to come home, my mother would tell me it wasn't a good time, that Dad was too tired, that they had it handled. She managed access to my dying father the way she had managed everything else. As a gatekeeper, deciding who deserved to be close and who did not. And she had decided, long ago, that I did not. But my father, even dying, even weak, found ways. He would call me himself, from his cell phone, when my mother was out of the house. "Come this weekend," he'd whisper. "She's going to your aunt's on Saturday. Come then. We'll have the afternoon." And I would fly across the country for a stolen afternoon with my dying father, timed around my mother's absence, because it was the only way. We would sit in the kitchen, or later, when he couldn't leave his bed, I would sit beside him, and we would talk. And it was in those stolen hours that the truest relationship of my life reached its end. I want to tell you, those stolen afternoons are among the most precious things I own. My family thought they were controlling my access to my father, punishing me even in his death. What they didn't understand was that the hours I fought for were real in a way their constant, easy access never was. They were in the house every day and saw a dying man they were already mentally cataloging for his assets. I flew across a country for a single afternoon and saw my father. There is no comparison. Presence is not the same as seeing. They had presence. I had him. The last real conversation I had with my father was 8 months before he died. I didn't know it would be the last. You never do. I had flown home for his 72nd birthday, a rare visit, made rarer by how unwelcome my mother's coldness made me feel. And on the second night, as had become our ritual, my father found me in the kitchen at midnight. He looked older than I remembered, tired, but his eyes when he looked at me were sharp and clear. "Claire," he said, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything, Dad." "When I'm gone," he said, "there's going to be a lot of noise. Your mother, your brother, your sister, they've got plans, and those plans don't include you." "I know that. I've known it for years." He paused, and I saw something move across his face, grief, maybe, or regret, for all the years he'd stayed silent. "I need you to promise me that no matter what happens, no matter what they say to you or about you, you won't fight them, you won't argue, you'll just let it happen. Can you do that for me?" I was confused. It sounded like he was asking me to accept my own erasure, to go quietly. "Dad, I don't understand." "I know you don't," he said, "and I can't explain, not yet, but I need you to trust me. When the time comes, whatever they do, let them do it. Don't fight. Just watch, and trust that your old man saw more than he ever let on." He reached across the counter and took my hand, which he almost never did. "I spent 40 years letting your mother win the small battles, Claire, but I've been very, very careful about the one that actually matters. Promise me you'll trust me." I promised. I didn't understand, but I promised. And 8 months later, he was gone, and I finally began to understand what my quiet father had been planning all along. My father died on a Tuesday in March. The funeral was a strange, cold affair, my mother playing the grieving widow with a theatricality that would have embarrassed my father deeply. I stood at the back. I was not asked to speak. Bethany gave a eulogy about what a wonderful family we all were, and I stood among strangers and said goodbye to the only person in that family who had ever truly seen me. I want to tell you about the morning of the will reading, because the small details have stayed with me. I had flown in the night before and stayed at a hotel not at my mother's house, which was now, I would soon learn, entirely hers. No one offered me a room. No one asked if I needed one. I stayed at a Marriott near the airport, alone, and I lay awake most of the night wondering why I had even come. My father's instruction echoed in my head, whatever they do, let them do it, just watch. But in the dark of that hotel room, it felt less like wisdom and more like a request to show up for my own humiliation. The next morning, I drove to Gerald Prentice's office in a rental car, and as I drove, I made a decision. I decided that whatever happened in that room, I would keep my promise to my father. I would not fight. I would not cry. I would give my mother nothing to use against me. I told myself I was doing it for him, because I had promised. I did not yet know that I was also doing it because he had arranged, in advance, for my restraint to be rewarded in a way I couldn't imagine. I arrived early. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, watching my family arrive, my mother in her new suit, stepping out of Aaron's car, Bethany pulling up separately, checking her makeup in the visor mirror before getting out. They gathered on the sidewalk outside the office, the three of them, and I watched them laugh about something. Laugh. 2 weeks after burying my father, on the morning of the reading of his will, they stood on the sidewalk and laughed. And I understood, watching them through my windshield, that they were happy. My father's death had, for them, resolved into a pleasant administrative event. The day they would finally divide the estate and be rid of the disappointment for good. I waited until they went inside, and then I followed. But something happened at the funeral that I didn't understand until later. As I stood at the back, a man I didn't recognize approached me, older, 70s, weathered hands, an ill-fitting suit that he clearly only wore to funerals. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You're Claire, aren't you? You've got his eyes." I said I was. "I worked for your father 38 years, he said. "Loading dock, mostly. Retired now." He was quiet for a moment. "He talked about you." Not to the others. I don't think the others knew he talked about anybody. But sometimes, late, when he'd come down to the floor to get away from the office, he'd talk to me. "And he talked about you. His daughter who went off and built something on her own. He was proud of that. Prouder than he ever was of the ones who stayed." The man looked over at my mother, Aaron, and Bethany, receiving condolences at the front of the room like a receiving line at a wedding. "I don't know what's going on with your family," he said. "It's none of my business. But I wanted you to know that your father saw you. He saw you plenty. He just wasn't a man who could say a thing out loud. He said it to an old dock worker instead, because that was safer than saying it where your mother could hear." And then he shook my hand and walked away, and I never saw him again. But I have thought about him 1,000 times, because he was the first evidence before the letter, before I understood anything, that my father's silence had never been emptiness. It had been full of me, the whole time, spoken quietly to safe people in safe corners, a father's love for his overlooked daughter kept alive in the one place my mother would never look, the loading dock. Among the workers, where the promise my grandfather made was still being kept every single day. I sat at the end of the table, my mother sat at the head, in my father's chair, and Gerald Prentice opened a folder and began to read. The business went to Aaron. The house went to my mother. Bethany received a substantial cash bequest and a vacation property. There were gifts to grandchildren, to a charity or two. And then Gerald Prentice reached the line they had all been waiting for. "To my daughter Claire," he read, "I leave nothing. She knows why." I want to describe my mother's face in that moment, because I will remember it for the rest of my life. She smiled. It was not a large smile, my mother was too controlled for that. It was small, private, satisfied. The smile of a person watching a plan come to fruition exactly as designed. Across the table, Bethany squeezed my mother's hand. Aaron finally looked up from his phone, glanced at me to gauge my reaction, and then went back to scrolling. Bored, the entertainment concluded. They were all watching me, waiting. Waiting for me to cry, or to argue, or to beg. Waiting for the disappointment to finally break down and give them the scene that would justify everything, that would prove, once and for all, that I was exactly the ungrateful, unstable, unworthy child they had always said I was. And I remembered my father's hand on mine in that kitchen. Whatever they do, let them do it. Don't fight, just watch. So I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I looked at my mother's satisfied smile and I nodded slowly, and I said, "I understand." And I watched something flicker across her face, confusion, maybe even disappointment. She had wanted a reaction. She had wanted the scene. And I had denied her, not out of strength I felt in that moment, but out of a promise to a dead man I trusted, more than I trusted my own understanding of what was happening. "Well," my mother said, recovering, unable to resist one final twist of the knife. "I hope this teaches you something, Claire. This is what happens when you turn your back on your family. Your father saw the truth about you in the end. We all did." I said nothing. I gathered my purse, and I stood to leave. And that is when Gerald Prentice cleared his throat and said, "Actually, Claire, Before you go, your father left separate instructions. There's a letter. He asked that you receive it privately after the reading. If you'll stay a moment, the others can go." The room changed. I watched my mother's satisfied expression curdle into something wary. "What letter?" she said. "There's no other letter. Gerald, the will is the will." "The will is the will," Gerald agreed calmly, "and it has been read in full. This is a separate, private matter that Mr. Bennett arranged independently. It doesn't concern the estate as read. Claire, if you'll stay, everyone else is free to go." My mother did not want to leave. I could see it. Some instinct told her that the ground was shifting beneath her, that the quiet husband she had steamrolled for 40 years might have had one more move in him. But there was nothing she could do. The will had been read, her prizes were secured, and whatever this letter was, it was, legally, none of her business. She stood, stiffly, and gathered Aaron and Bethany, and the three of them left the conference room, my mother throwing one last, uncertain look over her shoulder as she went. And then it was just me and Gerald Prentice, and a sealed envelope with my name on it, in my father's handwriting. "Your father was a careful man," Gerald said, sliding the envelope across the table. "Far more careful than most people gave him credit for. Take your time." My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages, in my father's cramped, precise handwriting. And as I read it, I began to understand the full scope of what my quiet, overlooked, underestimated father had done. I want to tell you about the very first sentence of that letter, because it broke something open in me before I'd even understood what the letter was. The first line was not about money. It was not about the trust, or the company, or any of the machinery my father had built. The first line in his careful handwriting was this: "Claire, if you kept your promise and didn't fight them in that room, then you're exactly the daughter I always knew you were. And I'm so proud I could burst." That was the first thing. Before he explained anything, before he revealed the enormous thing he'd done, my father's first instinct was to reach across death and tell me he was proud of me, and to tell me that my restraint in that room, the restraint that had cost me so much, the restraint that had let my mother smile at my humiliation, had been seen and understood and honored. He knew exactly what it had cost me to sit there and say, "I understand," while my mother twisted the knife. And the first thing he wanted me to know was that he had seen the cost, and that I had passed a test I didn't even know I was taking. I have received a lot of praise in my life, in my career, from people who valued what I could do for them. That single handwritten sentence from my dead father meant more than all of it combined. Because it was the only praise I ever received from someone who wanted nothing from me, who was already gone, who had no reason left to flatter or manage me. It was just true. He was proud of me. He'd said so, and he'd arranged for me to read it at the exact moment I most needed to hear it. "My dear Claire," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the will has been read, and you've just watched your mother smile at the news that I left you nothing. I'm sorry you had to sit through that. I need you to know it was necessary. Let me explain." And then my father explained the thing he had spent the last 5 years of his life quietly arranging. The letter laid out the whole thing, and as I read it, I kept having to stop, because the sheer patience of what my father had done was almost unbearable to absorb. 5 years. For 5 years, my quiet father had been running a second, secret operation beneath the surface of our family's life. While my mother narrated everyone's futures at the dinner table, while Aaron settled comfortably into his role as heir, while Bethany wore my grandmother's stolen ring, my father had been meeting quietly with a second attorney, not Gerald Prentice, who handled the family's known affairs, but someone entirely separate, someone my mother had never met and would never think to look for. He had moved slowly, deliberately, in amounts small enough not to attract attention. A transfer here, a restructuring there, the sale of a commercial property, the proceeds of which everyone assumed had gone into the general accounts but had actually gone into the trust. Most remarkably, he had restructured the ownership of Bennett Restaurant Supply itself, years earlier, creating a holding company that technically owned the controlling interest, a holding company whose sole beneficiary was the trust in my name. On paper, to anyone who didn't dig deep, the business still looked like it belonged to the family, would pass to Aaron, was exactly what everyone assumed. Underneath, it had already, quietly, become mine. "I did it slowly," my father wrote, "because slow is how you win against someone like your mother. She fights fast and loud. She's very good at fast and loud. So I never gave her a fast, loud thing to fight. I gave her nothing to see at all. By the time anyone could possibly notice, it was already done, already legal, already years in the past, and impossible to unwind. Your mother spent 40 years underestimating my silence. She thought a quiet man was a weak man. She never understood that quiet is just where patient people do their best work. There was a section of the letter about my grandfather, and it undid me completely. Your grandfather started Bennett Restaurant Supply with $400 and a truck, my father wrote. I spent my life growing it. And for a long time, I assumed it would go to Aaron, because that's the story your mother told, and I was tired of fighting her stories. But then one day I watched your grandmother's ring appear on Bethany's finger, and I watched you say nothing. And I realized something. Aaron wants the business the way your mother wants everything, as a possession, as proof of his place, as a thing to own. But you, Claire, you're the only one who ever understood what your grandfather actually built. Not a company, a thing that takes care of people, employees who've been there 30 years, families that depend on it. Your grandfather used to say the business was a promise to everyone who worked in it. Aaron sees a possession. You would see the promise. That's why it has to be yours, not because you're owed it, because you're the only one who would keep the promise. I had to put the letter down at that point, because I understood, suddenly, that my father had not left me the company as a reward, or even as an act of justice. He had left it to me because he trusted me with something sacred, the thing his father built, the livelihoods of hundreds of people, and he trusted me with it precisely because I was the one who had never wanted it for the wrong reasons. The disappointment, the one who left, the one who wanted nothing, I was the only one he could trust to hold it well. The letter went on, and this is the part that made me weep in that conference room. I know you're wondering why I did it this way, my father wrote. Why I let you sit through that reading. Why I let your mother smile at you. Why I didn't just leave you your share openly and be done with it. Here's why, Claire. If I had left it openly, they would have taken it from you. Not the money, maybe, but everything else. They'd have spent years telling everyone you were a thief who manipulated a dying man. They'd have made your grief a courtroom. They'd have turned my death into a weapon against you. I couldn't allow that. I love you too much to let my death become one more thing they used to hurt you. So I did it quietly. The way I did everything in this family, quietly, underneath, where your mother couldn't see. For 40 years, she thought my silence meant surrender. It never did. It just meant I was choosing my battles. And this was the one that mattered. This was the one I was never, ever going to lose. You get to decide what happens next, the letter continued. You own the company your grandfather built. You can keep Aaron on or not, that's your choice now, not theirs. You have more than enough to never worry about money again. But more than any of that, Claire, I need you to know, you were never the disappointment. You were the only one of my children who ever loved me for myself, and not for what I could give you. The others gathered today to divide my money. You came to say goodbye to your father. I saw that. I always saw everything. And I made very sure that the one child who loved me honestly would be the one who inherited what I actually valued. Not the money, the trust. The knowing that someone saw who I really was. I want to be honest about the money, because these stories can make it sound like the inheritance was the point, and it wasn't. And I don't want to lie to you about that. Yes, my father left me a great deal. The trust was substantial. The controlling interest in the company was worth more than I'd earn in several lifetimes. In pure financial terms, I went from being a comfortable professional to being genuinely wealthy in the space of one afternoon in a lawyer's office. But here is the truth. The money was the least of it. I already had enough. I had built a good life, an honest living, a home I loved. I did not need my father's fortune, and if you had offered me a choice between the money and one more midnight conversation with him in that kitchen, I would have chosen the kitchen without a half-second's hesitation, and I would choose it every day for the rest of my life. What the money meant, the only thing it really meant, was that my father had spent the last 5 years of his life thinking about me, planning for me, protecting me. While my mother was erasing me and my siblings were dividing me out of the family, my father was sitting in a second lawyer's office across town, quietly, patiently, building a fortress around the daughter everyone else had thrown away. The money was just the physical proof of 5 years of a dying man's love, expressed in the only language he had left, the language of careful, quiet, unstoppable planning. That's what I inherited. Not wealth. Evidence. Evidence that I had been loved all along, by someone who couldn't say it out loud, but who said it in the most permanent way a person can. The letter ended, and I want to share the last lines with you exactly, because I have them memorized now. I'm sorry I wasn't braver while I was alive, Claire. I'm sorry I let your mother run you down for 40 years and only fought back in secret, in documents, where you couldn't see it and take comfort from it. A better man would have stood up at the dinner table and told them all to stop. I wasn't that man. I was quiet. It was my great flaw and, I suppose, in the end, my one useful weapon. But I need you to know that every time I stayed silent while they diminished you, I went home and I moved another piece into place. My silence was never agreement. It was the sound of me building you a door out of that family, one they could never lock. Walk through it, Claire. Take what I've left you and build something good with it. Keep your grandfather's promise. And know, every day for the rest of your life, that you were seen. You were seen the whole time, by me. I'm sorry it took my death for you to find out. I hope it was worth the wait. All my love, always, Dad. He had known, he wrote, exactly what my mother, Aaron, and Bethany intended. He had watched them systematically write me out of the family, and he had understood that if he simply left me an equal share in his will, they would contest it, tie it up in court for years, poison every relationship, and very likely find a way to take it from me anyway. My mother would frame me as a manipulator who had coerced a dying man. They would make my life hell. A conventional inheritance, my father knew, would not protect me. It would only paint a target on my back. So, he did something else. Over the previous 5 years, quietly, without telling anyone, my father had been moving assets. Not into the estate that would be read in that conference room, into a separate trust, established in my name, managed by a different attorney, entirely outside the will my family was so excited to divide. He had transferred the majority of his liquid wealth, his investment accounts, the proceeds from a commercial property he had sold, and, most stunningly, a controlling interest in Bennett Restaurant Supply itself, held through a holding company my family didn't even know existed into that trust. The business my brother Aaron had just inherited, my father had left Aaron the operational role, the title, the office. But the controlling ownership, the actual power, the majority stake, had been quietly moved, years earlier, into the trust that belonged to me. Aaron would run the company, but I would own it. And there was nothing any of them could do about it, because it had all been done legally, cleanly, years in advance, entirely outside the will they had just celebrated. I sat in that conference room for a long time after I finished the letter. Gerald Prentice waited, patient, a man who had clearly known exactly what was in that envelope and had been waiting years to see it delivered. He was very proud of this arrangement, Gerald said quietly. He worked on it for a long time. He wanted to make sure it was airtight. It is. I want you to understand that clearly, Claire, there is nothing they can do. The trust is valid. It predates any question of his competency, and it is entirely separate from the contestable estate. You own the controlling interest in Bennett Restaurant Supply. The decision about what to do with that is yours alone. I asked him the question that mattered most to me. Did my father want me to tell them, or to keep it quiet? Gerald smiled slightly. He said, and I'm quoting him now, "Let Claire decide. She'll know the right thing to do. She always did. That's why it's hers. I want to tell you what I did, because I think it surprised everyone, including me. I did not storm out of that office and call my mother to gloat. I did not immediately fire Aaron and seize the company in a blaze of vengeance. I went home to my own home, 3 states away, the life I had built for myself, and I sat with it for a month. I want to pause here and tell you about the life I went home to, the life my family had never once asked about, because it matters for understanding the choice I made. For 24 years, while my family was busy deciding I was a disappointment, I had been building something. I had a career I loved, in a field none of them ever bothered to understand. I had a husband, David, a kind, steady man my family had met exactly twice, at our wedding, which my mother attended with the air of someone doing me an enormous favor, and at one Christmas, after which, she never mentioned him again. I had friends who had become a chosen family, people who showed up, who saw me, who knew the sound of my laugh and the shape of my dreams. I had a home that was warm and full and mine. My biological family had never seen any of it. In 24 years, not one of them had ever visited the life I built. Not once. They had a fixed image of me, the disappointment, the one who left and they had never updated it, never grown curious. Never wondered whether the daughter they'd written off might have become someone remarkable in the years they weren't looking. And so, when I sat with my father's letter, and with the staggering thing he had done, I sat with it inside a life that was already whole. That's the part my mother could never have understood. She thought she had left me with nothing. But I had gone home to everything, to David, to my friends, to a life I had built precisely because they had freed me, through their neglect, to build it. My father's inheritance did not complete me. I was already complete. What it did was something quieter and more profound. It confirmed, in a language that could not be argued with, that the life I'd built alone had been worth building all along. Between the reading of the will and my decision about what to do, there were about 4 weeks. And I want to tell you how I actually spent them, because it wasn't dramatic. I went home. I told my husband David everything, read him the letter, watched this steady man cry at a kitchen table for a father-in-law he'd barely been allowed to know. I went to work. I walked my dog in the mornings. I did the ordinary things, and I let the enormous things settle slowly into the ordinary life, because I had learned, from my father, that the biggest decisions are best made quietly, over time, underneath, where the noise can't reach them. I talked to Gerald Prentice twice more on the phone. He walked me through the full scope of what I now controlled, the numbers, which were larger than I had let myself imagine, the structure, which was, as he'd promised, completely airtight, the responsibilities, which were real. I was now responsible for a company that employed nearly 200 people. That was not nothing. My father had not just handed me wealth. He'd handed me a duty, the same duty his father had handed him, the promise. And slowly, over those 4 weeks, I came to understand that the question was never going to be, how do I use this against them? The question my father had actually left me was quieter and much harder. Who are you going to be, now that you finally have the power the people who diminished you never thought you'd have? That was the real inheritance, not the money. The question, and how you answer that question, it turns out, is the whole measure of a person. The reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks later. at the office of my parents' longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Prentice. And I want you to understand the atmosphere in that room, because it tells you everything about my family. They were excited, not grieving excited. My mother wore a new suit. Aaron and Bethany arrived together, chatting, almost giddy. There was an energy in that conference room, like the energy before a game show, everyone waiting for the prizes to be handed out. My father had built real wealth, the business, the house, investments, several properties, and his 3 favorite children had gathered to collect, with the disappointment invited only, I suspected, so that she could watch herself receive nothing. And in that month, I understood something about the difference between my father and the rest of my family. And in that month, I understood something about the difference between my father and the rest of my family. My mother, Aaron, and Bethany would have used this power immediately, loudly, cruelly. They would have made it a spectacle. That was who they were. And my father had given the power to me, specifically because he knew I was not like them. He had trusted me not just with the money, but with the character required to hold it well. So here is what I did. I kept the company, but I did not fire my brother. I flew home, and I sat Aaron down, just Aaron, not my mother, and I told him the truth about what our father had done. I watched his face go through every stage, disbelief, then anger, then a dawning, sickening understanding of what it meant. He had spent his whole life being the favored son, and he had just learned that our quiet father had seen through all of it, and had entrusted the family legacy to the daughter they'd all thrown away. "You could fire me," Aaron said finally, his voice small. "You own it. You could take everything, the way we tried to take everything from you." "I could," I said, "but I'm not going to. Because I'm not you, and I'm not our mother. Dad didn't give me this so I could become the thing that hurt me. He gave it to me because he trusted me to be better than that. So you'll keep your job, Aaron. You'll run the company. But you'll do it knowing who actually owns it, and knowing that the sister you called a disappointment for 40 years is the one who chose to let you keep your livelihood. That's the arrangement. Take it or leave it." He took it. Of course he took it. I want to give you more of that conversation with my brother, because it was the hardest and most important conversation of my adult life, and because it's where I found out who I actually was. We met at a diner neutral ground, not the office, not our mother's house. I watched Aaron walk in, and I saw, for the first time, how frightened he was. Word had reached him that I'd stayed behind after the will reading, that there was some letter. And in the weeks since, I imagine, he had been slowly piecing together that something was wrong, that the ground beneath his inheritance was not as solid as he'd believed. I told him plainly. I told him about the trust, about the holding company, about the controlling interest that had been mine for years without any of us knowing. I watched his face as it landed, and here is the thing I had not expected. I felt no triumph. I had imagined, in my darker moments over the years, how it would feel to finally have power over the brother who had spent 4 decades making sure I lost. And now that the moment was here, I felt only a kind of sad tenderness for him, because I could see, so clearly, how small he suddenly was. His whole identity had been the heir. And in an instant, that identity had evaporated, and underneath it, there was just a frightened, middle-aged man who had never been taught to be anything other than favored. "Say something," I said finally, because he had gone silent. "I don't understand why he did it this way," Aaron said. His voice was hollow. "If he wanted you to have it, why not just say so? Why humiliate all of us? Why let Mom smile at you, and then why the trick?" And I realized Aaron genuinely didn't understand, and probably never would, the thing that was so obvious to me. Because if he'd done it openly, I said, you'd have destroyed me for it. All of you. You'd have spent years and every dollar you had making sure I never got to keep it, and making my life hell in the process. Dad knew that. He didn't do it quietly to humiliate you, Aaron. He did it quietly to protect me from you. That's the part I need you to sit with. He knew exactly what his own children were capable of, and he was right. Aaron flinched, because it was true, and some part of him knew it was true. And then, I made Aaron an offer that surprised even me. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "I own the company. That's settled, it's legal, it's done. But I don't want to run a restaurant supply business 3 states away from my actual life, so I'm going to keep you on. You'll run the day-to-day, the way you have been. You'll draw your salary. From the outside, almost nothing changes." Aaron looked up, wary, waiting for the catch. "But 3 things change," I said. "First, you'll know who owns it, and you'll run it knowing that. Second, there's a woman named Patricia Doyle who's worked in your shipping department for 31 years, and last year you cut her hours to save money, and she's been struggling. You'll restore her hours and her back pay this week, because Grandpa's company was a promise to the people who work in it, and you forgot that, and I haven't. And third, and here my voice caught, just slightly, you'll never, ever again refer to me as the disappointment. Not to my face, not to Mom, not in that group chat I was never added to. That word is retired. Do we understand each other?" Aaron nodded. He couldn't speak, and I saw, in his eyes, the beginning of something that might, in a decade, with a lot of work, become respect, or at least the end of contempt. It wasn't love. We would never have what my father and I had. But it was a new arrangement, built on truth instead of on roles, and it was more than we'd ever had before. Bethany came to see me too, a few weeks later. She showed up at my hotel. I was still in town, sorting out the transition, and she was holding a small box. Inside was my grandmother's ring. I heard, she said, she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. About the company, about what Dad did. And I've been thinking about this ring. Grandma wanted you to have it. I always knew that. Mom gave it to me, and I just took it. Because that's what I do. I take what Mom hands me, and I don't ask where it came from. She set the box on the table between us. I don't know how to be a different person than the one Mom made me, but I can give you back your ring. It's a small thing. It's the only thing I know how to do. And that, from Bethany, was an enormous thing, maybe the first genuinely independent act of her adult life. The first time she had ever done something our mother would disapprove of because she, Bethany, had decided it was right. I took the ring. And I hugged my sister, who had spent 40 years being a mirror for our mother, and who was now, at last, trying to become a person. Thank you, I said. This matters more than the company, Beth. I mean that. I wear my grandmother's ring now. Every day, the company, the trust, the money, those sit in the background of my life, managed carefully, kept as the promise my father asked me to keep. But the ring is the thing I touch. Because the ring is the story in miniature, the thing that was always meant to be mine, taken quietly, and given to the favored child, worn casually for years by someone who didn't understand its meaning, and then, finally, returned, by a sister who was just beginning to wake up, to the granddaughter the old woman had actually chosen. My grandmother said I was the one who was like her, the one who sees things instead of just looking. She was right, and so was my father. The two quiet ones in my family, the grandmother and the father, the two people who spoke the least, they were the only two who ever saw me clearly, and in the end, between them, they made sure I knew it. A ring and a company, a sapphire and a promise. The two quietest people in my family shouting, in the only language they had, across the distance of death, "We saw you, Claire. We always saw you." My mother was a different matter. She found out Aaron told her, unable to carry the secret, and she called me in a fury, and for the first time in my life, I let her get all the way through her tirade without interrupting, without defending myself, without shrinking, and when she was done, when she had exhausted every accusation, I said one thing. Dad saw everything, Mom. For 40 years, he saw everything. He saw how you treated me, and he saw why, and when it mattered, he chose me, not because I asked him to. I didn't even know. He chose me because I was the only one who ever loved him instead of his money. Sit with that. That's not me punishing you. That's just the truth he left behind. And I hung up. Not in anger, just done. I want to tell you what I didn't do, because I think it's as important as what I did. I didn't cut my mother off completely. I didn't take the company away from Aaron out of spite. I didn't post the whole story online to humiliate them, though God knows I had the material. I didn't spend my father's gift on revenge. For a while, I wondered if that made me weak. Whether I owed it to my younger self, the 14-year-old at that dinner table, the 19-year-old on that phone call, the 43-year-old watching her mother smile at the reading of the will to make them all pay. There's a version of this story where I do, and I understand why people would cheer for it. But here's what I came to understand. My mother, Aaron, Bethany, they were trapped in something. A machine of roles and fear and scarcity that my mother built, and they all served. And the thing about that machine is that it makes everyone in it smaller, including the people who seem to be winning. My mother won every battle for 40 years and ended up a woman whose own husband built a secret escape hatch for the daughter she despised. Aaron got the throne and spent his life so afraid of losing it that he never became a person. Bethany got the ring and the beauty and the approval, and reached middle age not knowing who she was underneath our mother's expectations. I was the one they threw away, and I was the only one who got out. I got out because they pushed me out, and being pushed out forced me to build a self, a life, a world of my own. Their cruelty was, in the strangest way, the making of me. And once I understood that, revenge stopped making sense. You don't take revenge on the people who, however unintentionally, set you free. You just walk through the door your father built, and you close it gently behind you, and you go live the life their neglect made possible. 43 years of trying to earn a place in a family that had assigned me the role of disappointment before I could even speak, and I was finally, quietly, done auditioning. Before I go, I want to ask you something, and I'd really like an honest answer in the comments. Have you ever been the one your family decided to overlook the disappointment? The one who left? The one who wanted a different life and was punished for it? And have you ever wondered whether anyone, anywhere in that family, actually saw you? I want to tell you what I learned. because it took me 43 years and a letter from a dead man to understand it. The people who are loudest about their love are very often loving something other than you, your usefulness, your compliance, your willingness to play the role they assigned. And the people who truly see you are very often the quiet ones, the ones in the corner, the ones you mistake for absent. My father barely spoke. I spent years thinking he didn't see me at all, and he turned out to be the only one who saw me completely. If you are the overlooked one in your family, I want you to hear this. Their inability to see you is not evidence that you are invisible. It is evidence that they are not looking. Somewhere, someone sees you, maybe someone quiet, maybe someone you've underestimated the way I underestimated my father. And even if no one does, right now, you must do the one thing my father spent his whole life teaching me without words. You must see yourself. You must know your own worth, even when the people who are supposed to reflect it back to you have decided, for reasons that were never really about you, to look away. My father left me a company, but that was not the inheritance. The inheritance was the proof, held in a sealed envelope for the day I would need it most, that I had been seen all along. That my leaving was never a betrayal, that the disappointment was never disappointing, that I was, in the eyes of the one person whose vision was clear, exactly enough. They gathered to divide his money. I stayed to say goodbye, and in the end, the daughter who wanted nothing from him received the only thing that ever mattered, the knowledge that she was loved, honestly, by someone who saw her true. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who has spent too long being the overlooked one, waiting for a family to see what was there the whole time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way through. My name is Claire Bennett. I was my family's disappointment, and my quiet father, in the end, made me his heir, not to his fortune, but to his faith.